have just been, it must have a timeout function or something like that.
Ah, fair enough. Yeah.
Okay, well, to all those in the room who I don't know who's been in one of these webinars before, so obviously Gareth is spotlighted. So you're safe. If you speak, your voice will come out on the live stream. If you want to ask any questions, feel free to use the chat. And that's pretty much all I have to say. So I just want to clarify something though. Gareth is not my father. And you can tell that he's not my father because he doesn't have an Aussie accent. So just in case anybody was wondering if there's any connection between him and me, there's not. We both are examiners and we both are musicians, but they aren't genetic characteristics. So there's no family connection here.
And of course, I'm far too young.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, well, actually, let me clarify. Gareth is a retired examiner. I'm an active examiner. So that shows how much younger I am. Anyway, on that
Shucks, I'm not too young.
Um, I don't think Gareth needs much introduction. We've seen his YouTube channel, most of us, and hence why so many people have wanted to join us today. Thank you, Gareth, so much for accepting my invitation to come, and we look forward to everything you have to share with us.
A pleasure. Great to be with you. And thank you for those words of introduction. And probably the first thing I ought to say, because there have been many people who are natives of Australia, is good luck with the World Cup, because you're playing France today. So I hope that goes well for you. But French are a pretty good team, so good luck. Anyway, perhaps we ought to move on quickly from the football to rhythm, which is what we're thinking about today. And really, there's a very simple message that underpins what I'm going to present today, which is this. And it's based on the fact that, I mean, Sarah's talked about examining experience. It's probably her experience as well. But I mean, over 30 years of examining, one thing that has come across to me over and over again, particularly when it comes to sight reading, is how many people basically play the right notes, but how many people play the rhythm entirely inaccurately, or have only got a fairly hazy idea about the rhythm. And that's the biggest downfall when it comes to sight reading. You even notice it in the playing of pieces sometimes, where people do actually fundamentally play most of the right notes, but there's something about the rhythm that's not working very well. So why is it that we can kind of get people to play the right notes in most cases, but at the same time we've got this underlying problem with rhythm? So here's my simple theory on it, and then we'll explore how that might be underpinned. And it's as simple as this. I think there's actually a big difference between knowledge and understanding. And I think the temptation when we teach is that we do the knowledge without necessarily enforcing the understanding deeply enough. So what do I mean by that? Well, you know, some early stage when we're teaching, we're going to get hold of rhythm, aren't we? And we're going to say, well, you know, we've got these things called crotchets, or we might know them as quarter notes, and they're worth one beat. And we've got these things called minims that we otherwise know as half notes, and that's got two beats. So we teach people the knowledge, and most people get hold of that bit of knowledge fairly easily. And then we go on at some stage to talk about the impact of dots and what effect that has on the length of a note, all that kind of stuff. So we do the knowledge stuff quite well, but actually, how does the knowledge help you to play rhythm accurately? And that's the fundamental question. How do we move from knowledge to understanding? And it seems to me that the kind of fundamental question is not how long is this note? Because knowing that this note is 1.5 beats long is sort of useful, but doesn't actually really help you to play it, does it? What's 1.5? The question is, when do I need to play the next note? Or when do I need to stop playing this note, particularly if there's a rest that comes after it? So it's really thinking about the whole thing from a point of view of how do we begin to internalize that. All sorts of other associated difficulties here as well, of course, which you will well know as teachers. And one of them is this whole sense of actually, well, how can I deliver the rhythm if I'm not sure what the next note is? And that's a fundamental problem in sight reading. So it does relate to pitch, doesn't it? You know, if somebody's looking at the first note and thinking, well, that's a C, so they play C, and then they have to look at the next note and think, I wonder what that one is. Oh yeah, let me work this out. Oh, I think that's D. So then they play D, but there's no sense of rhythm because we're having some kind of underlying problem sorting out recognition of pitch. So I'm not saying that rhythm is an isolated thing. You've got to be able to deal with it in association with pitch as well. So fluency of reading pitch, and that's in a sense a separate topic from today's. We could talk about that. I think a lot of people when they're reading pitch are doing it in a very kind of syllabic way. You know, they're looking at a note thinking that note's C, and then they look at the next note and think, oh, that one's D. And they're not actually looking at patterns. So they're not seeing these are the notes that are spelling out a triad or the notes that are spelling out a scale run, finding patterns to read it. They're still reading in a way that they learnt to read when they were kids. They go n, d. And they never get to the point of saying, you know what, that's and. And we have to do a bit of that with the pitch. We're not going to get the rhythm going if we can't get that kind of connection and fluency with the reading of pitch. But I think another issue as well is that we perhaps underestimate how a lot of people have trouble sorting out a pulse. So knowing that a note is 2 beats long or 3 beats long, that's absolutely fine. But what does it mean if we haven't got a sense of pulse? Because how many students do you have who might do something like this? And again, I've seen and heard this so many times in the exam room. People are counting rhythm, but they're doing it like this. They're going 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1. So they're counting the right numbers, but there's no pulse in the thing. So the rhythm is completely inaccurate, not because they're doing the knowledge incorrectly, but the understanding isn't working at all. So obviously there are lots of things we need to do just to ensure that somebody knows about pulse. My kind of experience of mentoring teachers with this is that as a race, I think we're much better at dealing with this further down the line. You know, people play and you say to them, oh, it's rushing in that bar. Maybe because there's lots of semi-quavers and they're getting a bit excited, or you're slowing down, you're losing pulse in that bar because they're having trouble finding chords or whatever it is. But it's the earlier stage, isn't it, of actually just getting sorted out on actually, do we know about a regular pulse? Can we feel it? People have got all sorts of different views on whether metronomes are good or not. I have to say I'm a great believer in the metronome. I know the counter argument is that it can drive the musicianship out of you. There's certainly a danger of that, but actually doing some fundamental work with a metronome I think is important, because I think one thing we have to teach people to do is to internalize the metronome. We need to be driven by an internal pulse. And if we can't do that naturally, some people do it more naturally than others, well, the metronome is great because it doesn't lie to you. So that's the fundamental basis on which I'm kind of basing my thoughts on how do we go about teaching rhythm. Of course, lots of things could be done differently according to the ages of people you're working with, and you know, whether they're completely new to music or whether they've come to you on a second instrument, whatever it is. But I do believe it's worth doing some really good, thorough work on rhythm. So hopefully you can see on the screen that I've just got a couple of rhythms here that we could clap. So if I count 2 bars of a pulse, let's make this practical. Let's look at rhythm A. I'll count 2 bars of a pulse and ask you to clap this rhythm. Okay, so just have a go. Humor me for a moment. So here's 2 bars of a pulse and then clap rhythm A. 1, 2, 1, 2. Great stuff. Congratulations. I think we almost had a full house there. I can't hear it, but I can see people clapping. It's a fascinating sight, actually. But great stuff. Okay, now that comes fairly easily to us, doesn't it? But actually to someone who doesn't really get rhythm, They may have this knowledge, but they may do this. They may go 1, 1, half, half, 1. They're counting it, but they're not delivering an accurate rhythm at all. Now, I'm sure many of you do this idea that when you have a beat or a pulse, you try to divide it in half when the quavers come along by using and. That's such a useful thing to be able to do, isn't it? And actually working out what is the meter and therefore knowing where you are in a bar is more useful than doing this sort of 1, 1, half, half, 1 stuff, because you don't know where you are in the bar ultimately. And that has other implications, doesn't it, for what we're doing with emphasis with a meter when it comes to presenting a musical performance. But that's further down the track. But if we can at least do the half, so we use the and, so we go set up a pulse and then try and keep the pulse going and get them to clap so they can go 1, 2, 1 and 2, 1 and 2 and 1, 2. That at least is going to get them on a journey that's going to be able to start to divide a pulse. I think that's one of the early things that causes a huge amount of trouble. People can think in whole numbers. They can deliver a 1-beat note, a 2-beat note. Actually, when it comes to half beats, well, how do you do that? So the and is incredibly useful. I actually find when you first do this with people as well, they find it very difficult to bring the and on when they need it and to leave the and out when they don't need it. So there's a lot to be said for just counting the ands all the way. 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and so on. And then they can drop the ands when they don't need it. So you see the kind of thing that I think is worth doing, just taking little exercises like this. And I would start at a simpler level if someone's at the beginning of the rhythm journey here, obviously by not using quavers straight away or eighth notes. Start with simpler rhythms, but just sort of build up to simple little things like this. Now, why do this? Just clapping a rhythm. Well, I think there's a great deal to be said for just isolating this particular area. When you think about it, okay, here's a piece of music, go away and learn it this week. What are we asking them to do? We're asking them to think about pitch, about rhythm, possibly about chords if they're keyboard players, possibly dynamics, phrasing. It's a multitask issue, isn't it? And that's a lot to expect. So if we're going to have issues with rhythm, best thing we can do is isolate the rhythm. So having little exercises like this is really, really useful thing to be able to do, and just work through rhythm absolutely in isolation from anything else. Then you don't have all these associated problems about, I can't clap this rhythm because I don't know what the pitch name is of the next note or where it is or what the fingering is. We can just focus on rhythm, and it's going to instill some kind of internal sense of rhythm as well. So I would get going with obviously the fundamental understanding issues, kind of a bit of knowledge in terms of what notes are, how long we need to hold on to them for and so on, but then just do a bit of this kind of foundational work, isolating rhythm on its own. I think it's also useful to do this from an oral perspective, from as early on as possible. It's amazing, isn't it, when you think about it? I'm always fascinated. Every term, I'll get a phone call from someone saying, I'm having trumpet lessons or singing lessons with, whoever it is. And they've given me your number and they say, could I just come round and do the oral tests? So they just want to come for one lesson before they do grade whatever it is to do the oral tests. Well, that's a funny notion, isn't it? Do the oral test. What do we mean by this? It's some kind of ghastly torture that is put into an exam syllabus just to kind of make it even more terrifying for you. But it's kind of going against the whole notion of continuous oral development, isn't it? So I always think whatever we're doing, we need an oral perspective on this thing as well. So if you've got students who can start to do the kind of thing we've just been talking about now, well, how soon is it that you could play a rhythm and they could clap it back? So that's developing some sense of oral memory. But how soon could you move on from that and say to them, okay, you've managed to clap back the rhythm, you've memorized it, you've internalized it, that's great. Now tell me what those notes were, so that you can get them to do a little bit of hearing rhythm and then turning this project round and telling you what the length of notes might be. So, for example, here's just another possibility that you do something like this. So you don't show them this, but you play something like rhythm A, you get them to clap it back. You may need to do a little bit of work on kind of pulse and so on. Can everybody see that? If I zoom in, might be a bit clearer. How's that? Yeah. And then, oh, it's gone back in. Oh, no, too far. That'll do. Lovely. But actually get them to do it as an oral response, first of all. Can we remember the rhythm? Can we clap it back? Maybe can we think it with a pulse? And then can they tell you what the length of those notes is going to be? Because I think that's a fundamentally important part of this as well. We're not just doing it by reading and trying to play it, we're also hearing and trying to identify rhythm. So hopefully that will be a useful thing. So I'm just spouting on for dear life here, and you're very politely listening or sleeping through this or waiting for the football. If you've got questions, do shout, and I'll do my best to answer them. But I'll keep going for now. Okay, so that's the kind of notion that we're on. Now, what I'm suggesting then is that you might think about having a kind of ongoing, unfolding rhythm program, so that when you can do these sort of fundamental things, like can we deliver rhythms that have got crotchets and minims in them, or crotchets, minims and semi-breves and so on. Well, what happens when we start to bolt on things? Tied notes. Now, I can't tell you the number of times I've heard people sight read pieces at every level over the years that contain tied notes. Even people doing quick studies in diploma exams and so on get defeated by tied notes, which actually really is ridiculous at that stage. Why have they not got used to dealing with tied notes? Well, in this example, we start with a crotchet at the beginning, don't we, here? And then we've immediately got a tied note. Now, if that were a minim, probably some people would be happier with it. But as soon as they see a crotchet tied across a bar line to a crotchet, they somehow freak out and shorten the note, lengthen the note, something happens to it. I don't know how you deal with tied notes. I have a very simple way of dealing with this when I'm teaching, when people struggle with tied notes. I always say, play with the tied notes, but think it without the ties. So if you think it without the ties, and we just look at the first couple of bars of this, well, it's dead straightforward, isn't it? Because if you don't have to worry about the ties, all you've got to do is to deliver 4 crotchets. 1, 2, 1, 2. So that's how you think it, but when you play it, you just don't bother playing the 3rd crotchet. So you go 1, 2, 1, 2. So we don't have to freak out about tied notes. We simply think it without the ties, but play it with the ties. Of course, it's going to be more awkward when you come to this situation at the end, when you've got this quaver tied into the last minute. That's the sort of thing that can cause people to freak out. But if we just look at those last 2 bars for a moment, again, think it without the tie. You get 1, 2 and 1, 2. It's relatively straightforward. So think it without the tie, but play it with the tie. 1, 2 and 1, 2. You're in business. But it's exactly the kind of rhythm that will trip people up. So, bolt in tied notes so that we don't have to spend the next 10 or 20 years getting it wrong every time we see a tied note, but we're just learning how to deal with them. I honestly think it's worth putting a huge investment of time into rhythm. I mean, not as a disproportionate amount of a particular lesson, but if we keep building rhythm skills all the way through the journey, it's amazing how they then start to embed. I mean, I don't know what your experience is, but my experience of what I see in the exam room, particularly in relation to, people who play pieces really quite well and then make a total mess of the sight reading, It's kind of, what's that telling us? They've learnt 3 pieces or 4 pieces for an exam, whatever is required, by slogging away at them for months in some cases and memorizing them. So then they think, great, I can do grade 2, grade 4, whatever it is. But as soon as they finish those pieces, they're back at the starting blocks, because then you've got to do a set of pieces that are harder than the last set of pieces. So it becomes even more of a challenge, doesn't it? Because actually they've learnt the pieces by rote, but have they actually internalized the learning? So this is back on this whole underlying thing, knowledge, understanding. So this is what I'm talking about in relation to rhythm. I mean, we could talk about other elements of the playing as well, but this is really fundamentally useful, because if you invest a bit of time dealing with tied notes, for example, as we're looking at now, then that stays with them forever. So we can get to the point where actually tied notes never need to be a problem ever again. So it's time, definitely well invested. So that's that. Okay, well, you can then sort of build on. I mean, this is kind of racing a bit too quickly, but it's just to sort of show a path of progression through this. Obviously, there's theoretical work that needs to be done alongside this. No point in asking somebody to clap this rhythm before they know what a triplet is. But so we're going to have to explain that. What's a triplet? I mean, I don't know how you teach triplets. I always say, it's a bit like a really good supermarket offer, because it's 3 for the price of 2. So, kids are quite sort of into this one. If they can get 3 bars of chocolate for the price of 2, that engages them fairly quickly. But 3 quavers for the price of 2 quavers, it just helps them to see, okay, how does that work? So I've got these quaver triplets, 3 for the price of 2. So 3 quavers in the time of 2. Well, 2 quavers is 1 crotchet. So we immediately get to, this triplet, this quaver triplet, fills up 1 beat. So there's a bit of theoretical stuff to be done there. But, involve them in triplets, because how many people, when they play triplets, make a mess of it? Rhythmic augmentation, rhythmic diminution goes on. You get a bit of Scott Joplin goes on, don't you? Instead of a triplet, you get yatta, ta, and all this kind of stuff goes on. So just getting them to think, can I deliver triplets evenly? How do I get the idea of delivering a series of triplets inside a steady pulse, and so on and so forth? That's what that's about. But then starting to combine things. So if we've done some work on ties, and then we've done some work on triplets, well, could we do an exercise like this that's combining triplets and ties? Great, excellent. I'm just thinking there are 1 or 2 comments appearing on the screen. Let me just have a look at these. Quants, yes, it's always good to mention quants when you're talking about rhythm. The second note of the tie should be played as though it was individual, but not tongues. Yes, that's interesting, isn't it? An extra push of air. Yeah, that's a good point. 1 and 2 and, yeah, verses. Are they as good as each other? Do you think one is better? I think anything that kind of works. And I mean, I think one fundamental truth about teaching, is probably true of any teaching, but it's certainly true in one-to-one music teaching, is that you haven't got one size that fits all. I mean, the number of times I've taught something to somebody and then it's all worked perfectly, and the next person's come in and I've taught exactly the same thing in exactly the same way, and then you just see this puzzled face and you think, yeah, okay, it's not worked for you. How do we do this? We all know about different learning styles, don't we? And how some people have got the kind of brain that absorbs information and then they can apply it. Other people have to be very practical, hands-on with it. That's fine. You have to find what works for the student in question, don't you? I quite like the 1 and thing, simply because the and is defining the second half of a beat. And I think that is actually quite useful, because you can develop it in other ways. So if you've got a series of quavers, you can go 1 and 2 and. But of course, what happens if you get something like quaver 2 semiquavers? Well, then it's easier to get the 2 semiquavers to work on the and. 1 and 2 and. And they soon get the idea that you've got to divide your and, or if it's the other way around, 2 semiquavers quaver, 1 and 2 and. They're either dividing the number or they're dividing the and. I mean, you can use anything that works, Italian names, whatever. But I personally quite like the and. But the fundamental thing is you do what works. And sometimes, I don't know, I think it's all one of the excitements of teaching, actually. That you can be teaching for donkey's years and suddenly you find yourself teaching something in a completely new way to somebody because none of your conventional methods work. I do find this all quite interesting. I mean, as I say, I've done quite a bit of teacher mentoring over the years. What always worries me is when you go and observe a lesson, that might at one level be going very well, and then you have the sort of follow-up conversation, and somebody sort of starts to explain what they're doing, and they say, "Well, we always do the scale of A flat major in lesson 46." I think, that's got to be bad news, isn't it? Because you've got to have some idea where you're going. That's important. But you've got to be so flexible. Some people are going to get there faster. Some people are going to get there slower. Some people are going to get this aspect, but not that aspect. There are going to be different walls to climb at different stages. You've got to be incredibly flexible and be ready to do things in so many different ways. So, we're talking about rhythm, but, some people will get to this much more easily through an oral route. Some will get there much more easily through a notational route. So you have to bear that in mind, don't you? Okay, so that's good. So triplets and ties. Then you can do other things. Include your dotted notes and your ties and your triplets. So in other words, you're kind of building a kind of bank of experience that's saying, can you do these things one at a time? This is why personally I like to use specific exercises like this, because you can never find a piece that just delivers one aspect. Pieces are always combinations of rhythms, aren't they? So do all these things individually, but then have exercises that combine them in a sort of focused way. So you're just dealing with 4 bars or something that's got a dotted note, a tie, a triplet. Can we combine all of these things? And if we can't, well, fine, we can break it down again, can't we? And take a step back. But this is a kind of whistle-stop tour that I'm on here, just to give you the idea. This next one, just alerting us to what happens when the time signature changes. Now, here's another thing that just comes out of years of observing all this, really, that actually, if you're in 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, that tends to go better than if we've got anything else as a lower number. So the minute you've got something else as a lower number, people's rhythm goes out of the window, which I find quite interesting because it means somewhere down the line, we maybe haven't done enough on this. So, okay, again, there's a theoretical aspect to this, isn't there? If we can do 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, well, it's not a huge step to go 2/2, 3/2, 4/2, but we need to get experienced in it. So do we get the idea? What happens to a rhythm when it's in 2/2 instead of in 2/4? All the lengths look as if they've doubled, don't they? Well, but how does that relate to the pulse? And can we begin to think with a minim pulse? Or something like this 3/8 example. If that rhythm were printed in 3/4, there'd be many musicians who we work with who'd be very happy to deliver that in 3/4. But given the same rhythm in 3/8, it'll be a complete shambles because they haven't got the idea of dealing with a quaver pulse. Apart from all those confusions you get about once they get into compound time, they get an idea about 6/8, 9/8, 12/8, and they think 3/8 is some kind of compound time, when of course it's a simple time. So all of that stuff needs to be explained. And then as soon as you get to 16 as a lower number, well, that's when we do lose a lot of people. But actually 16 as a lower number, how many times do you see that in Bach, for example? So it's something we need to do business with. So there's a little campaign corner from me, as working through the rhythm agenda. Don't forget to change the lower numbers. Don't just deal with 4, but get people comfortable with 2, 8, 16 as the lower numbers as well. And again, exercises that just give them confidence in dealing with that. Obviously, compound time, and we're normally going to start with 6/8, 9/8, 12/8, but what about 6/4, 9/4, 12/4, 6/16, 9/16, 12/16? Rhythms like rhythm B here will really defeat a lot of people. Even people at quite an advanced level might struggle with that and wouldn't really kind of relate that to something that they actually know much better. So we might be happy in 12/8, but we're not happy in 12/16. So again, it's just kind of unfolding all of this. So we make a sort of progressive journey. Obviously, if you're teaching someone who's doing grade 1, you don't need to worry about 12/16, but it's something that's going to keep coming back. The point I'm trying to make here is that rhythm isn't something that we just sort of upload at the beginning of a journey and then hope for the best. It's something we keep revisiting and we keep developing at a stage that's appropriate to where people are. So, bit on that. Obviously, clapping rhythms in compound time. Are they happy clapping in 6/8 time? How do they do it? I mean, it's quite interesting, isn't it? What do you do with 6/8? I mean, when people are sight reading, if they're not confident with compound time, it makes a lot of sense that they actually count 6. It's not what they should be doing, but it does actually make sense that they count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, in order to work it out. And that's a perfectly reasonable starting point. If they're going to be able to do this with musical confidence, of course, they need to be able to do this with 2 beats and a bar. So at some point down the line, where do we get them to convert their thinking when they're in compound time from just clapping individual quavers to thinking about 2 dotted crotchet beats and a bar? If we can do all that stuff in 6/8, can we do it in 6/4? Lots of people are completely defeated by 6/4, partly because they don't realize it's a compound time. So the fundamental knowledge of, do we know what the difference is between simple and compound time? I think a lot of people don't get that at all. So things kind of sound strange because they haven't got any kind of sense of the 2 beats and a bar in 6/4. So you see where all this is going. Can we clap rhythms in compound time, including duplets? Well, we meet triplets a lot. We don't meet duplets very often. So when they come up, particularly in sight reading tests, they're nearly always wrong. Nearly always do duplets go wrong. So if we've done 3 for the price of 2, are we ready for a less attractive supermarket deal, 2 for the price of 3? So we can learn to deal with our duplets as well. So doing some work on duplets. What about irregular time signatures? That's another thing that needs to be conquered at some point. Can we deal with things that have got 5 at the top or 7 at the top? And what are we doing? Well, maybe initially we're counting 5 or counting 7, but how does the bar divide? Is it 2 plus 3? Is it 3 plus 2? Is it the same all the way through? All this kind of stuff. I'm amazed at how many pieces of music, sight reading particularly, printed in 5/4 that I've heard played in 4/4 over the years. It's amazing that people have got the ability to read a piece of music they've not seen before and re-engineer the time signature. I think they should get extra marks for that, actually. But on the other hand, they're not actually reading in 5/4, are they? Because we have something in our brain that wants to make things feel regular. So if it's irregular, we're sort of thinking, I must be doing something wrong. So subconsciously, we kind of start to re-engineer things because we haven't actually got the fundamental confidence with the rhythm. So you see, this is another phase. You may not want to do all of this stuff in the order in which I'm presenting it. It partly depends when these things come up on the journey. What about this one? Syncopation. My goodness, that causes a load of bother, doesn't it? Even in pieces that people are preparing for performance, I find syncopation goes wrong. So actually dealing with things going across beats. Now, if you look at this exercise for a moment, I think this is quite an interesting one in terms of how do we get people to deal with it? By breaking down the beats again, using the ands. If you try and clap the first bar in beats, well, probably most of us here would be quite happy to do that. 1, 2, 3, 4. Actually, if the sort of whole syncopation agenda is not something you're comfortable with, how on earth are you going to deliver that rhythm? You're more likely to deliver it if you do this. 1 and 2 and 3, 4. So again, bringing back the ands is quite useful because it's showing you where these half beats are. When you've got a note that starts on the second half of a beat and trails across the first half of the next beat, the ands are incredibly useful. So things like this kind of exercise in syncopation. So again, when are you going to introduce this? Well, the first time you meet syncopation. So if you're going to play some Scott Joplin or something, or do a bit of jazz or something, well, syncopation pretty important. So that's when you might introduce it. I don't think there's much point in introducing anything rhythmically unless it has a musical context. So, you know, that's why I'm saying be flexible with the order in which you do things. I'm presenting these kind of topics, rhythm topics, if you like. But, you know, as and when it comes up, you've got a piece that involves syncopation, fine. Let's get clapping some syncopation. Let's understand it. So the next time we meet it, we think we've been here before. Not we're thinking, oh no, it's another one of these ghastly things where the rhythm's difficult, because you're building the experience. So yeah, syncopation, another topic. When they get confident with it, what about this kind of stuff? You know, rhythms with displaced accentuation. A lot of people will just ignore accents, especially if they're in funny places. But I mean, even Beethoven is the master of displaced accent. It's not just a sort of 20th or 21st century thing. So can we get used to delivering a rhythm, but put displaced accents in the right place? It's another stage in that journey, if you like. So there's another topic. What about these old friends? Rhythms involving irregular time divisions. Well, we may have converted our students to dealing with triplets. We may even have conquered duplets, but what about all these, you know, quintuplets and things, you know? Do they understand what it is? So again, there's some theoretical work to do there, isn't there, you know? If it's five for the price of four, isn't it? So, you know, what would four semiquavers be? Okay, can I deliver five semiquavers in the time of four semiquavers? Can I feel how that crotchet beat divides into five? So that we start to befriend irregular time divisions. You probably want to do this at a much earlier stage than I've got it in this presentation, but you know, obviously rhythms involving rests. That's another interesting thing, isn't it? Even in prepared pieces, how many people miscalculate rests? I find that's a frequent sin. Even if they can play rhythms accurately when they're playing notes, we get to a rest, and instead of actually counting the rest, I think a lot of them just think, oh, well, here's a rest. I've been here long enough. Let's carry on. And they don't actually count them. So doing some work that involves rest, I think fundamentally important. And of course, again, you know, rhythms that maybe involve a number of things combined. So this has got some semiquavers, it's got triplets, it's got three different kinds of rests in it. I mean, again, build up gradually. This is just sort of an example of something that might come up during the journey. What about things like this? Rhythms that involve anacrusis. You know, do we really understand anacrusis? Do we explain that to people sufficiently so they get the idea? And they need to think about that when they play a piece of music, isn't it? Because a lot of people will play something like this and put an emphasis on the first note just because they always do. You know, a wind or a brass player takes a huge breath and throws everything at the first note. Keyboard players put their hands down on the first note. So what you hear is 1, 2, 3, and 4 at the beginning of this. And you imagine you're listening to something in 4/4 instead of the notion of 3, 1, 2, and 3. And I find anacrusis is a great way of getting people to think about where are these strong beats? Where does the emphasis need to come? So very useful just to educate them in anacrusis and obviously explain about how the last bar matches up with the anacrusic start and so on. But getting them to feel a sense of, meter, where does the emphasis come in a meter? So we begin to do some musical work with rhythm and meter as well. So that's that. Now, what about this? Particularly for keyboard players, there must come a point where we get used to the idea of clapping two rhythms simultaneously. Now, how do you clap two rhythms simultaneously if you haven't got four hands? Well, of course, the answer to that is to do it on your knees or your thighs or something, so you can actually learn to do that. I find most people find this very difficult at first, but any keyboard player is doing this from a very early stage. And I don't think it's just keyboard players, because if you're playing a single line instrument, well, you need to be able to interact with other players, don't you? So being able to process more than one rhythm at a time, I think is quite a useful thing to do. I often find this has to be built up quite gradually, where you might sort of clap the upper part, then you might clap the lower part, and then move to a point where you can combine the two. And I always encourage people to think about not just reading this horizontally, but reading it vertically. So we're thinking, this is beat one, this is beat two. So when we look at a rhythm like this, we can think right, left, together, together, left. So we can kind of process when do the hands come together, when does one hand come in front of the other, and that is all about vertical reading. So I find that actually what we're doing is we're educating people to read rhythm in a linear way without necessarily at some point doing some vertical work on rhythm. I think that's profoundly important. So useful to all musicians, but I say particularly to keyboard players. Obviously, then we can get into the niceties of things like, can we do twos against threes and deal with all that kind of stuff as well. More complicated polyrhythms and irregular time divisions. Again, this is all part of a longer journey. So you can see where I'm suggesting we go with this. Swing rhythms, another important point. Amazing again, even with prepared pieces, how many people bring a prepared piece into the exam room or any other performance, and actually even when it says at the beginning 2 quavers equals crotchet, quaver, triplet, they play the rhythm straight and they don't swing them. So actually, do we understand swing rhythm and how that really works, and the idea of 2/3 plus 1/3 for pairs of quavers and so on? That's confusing as well, isn't it? Because we spent the last, I don't know how long, teaching people that 2 quavers is an equal division of a beat. And now we're saying, well, it usually is, but sometimes it isn't. You know, that's where people lose the will to live, isn't it? But actually explaining how a swing rhythm works. So can we read it? Can we understand it? But also, can we feel it? Again, all these things I think you have to take an oral dimension to. You know, that early thing we did about, okay, now you can do a bit of rhythm. Can you hear a bit of rhythm? Can you tell me what that rhythm is? Some people like to do it as a kind of dictation exercise, actually write it down. Some people are happy describing it to you. It doesn't really matter, but it's associating it all orally. So swing rhythms, another important topic. And then probably a much later stage, I think there's even this aspect to it as well, isn't there? You know, harmonic rhythm. When do chords change and what is the rhythm of chord change? So we begin to understand rhythm in other dimensions as well. Well, that is a kind of whistle-stop tour through a few thoughts on how we might actually go about teaching rhythm. You may have some other questions, or you may just need to lie down in a dark space after all that. I don't know. That's absolutely fine. One very quick thing from us that, you know, a lot of you realise that, you know, music matters. You can see it on the shirt down here. And we've got a web address, which is www.mmcourses.co.uk. We've got lots of online courses that are designed to empower people, including a rhythm bootcamp course. Where students can kind of really work through the kind of thing that I've talked about, but with loads of practical exercises and looking at it orally, looking at it theoretically, looking at it very practically. So if you're looking for a resource that might be useful to students, we've got that. But we've also got stuff on theory, oral test preparation for each of the grades. All the theory grades are covered, orchestration, all sorts of stuff, analysis, wherever you've got students who might find that particular stuff useful. And how about this? Just because you're all absolutely lovely people, if you are interested in going onto our website and having a look at these courses, for the next 48 hours, we are offering all of you 10% off every course on our site. How about that? And all you have to do is go on there, and if there's anything you're interested in, when you come to the checkout, you type in 10UTO. That's a nice, easy word to remember, isn't it? But if you put 10UTO in, you get 10% off, and that's a special 48-hour offer just because you're so lovely. So there we are. A few thoughts on rhythm. That's probably enough from me. Does anybody want to ask anything or say anything? Now's your moment.
I was wondering whether the 48 hours is different whether you're in Australia versus the UK, like because of the time zone difference.
It's 48 hours from the end of this session. whichever time zone you're in.
I did have a question, and that was when you were talking about when we're introducing 316 and those divisions. I've
Yeah.
found it really hard for students to understand, some students to understand that I can count one and two and three and when one is a crotchet, then trying to say, well, now
Yes.
I'm going to count one and two and three and but one is a quaver. Do you have a
Yes.
solution around this?
Yes. No, I think that's a very good question. When you're dividing a beat into three instead of into two. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I do think when I first work on compound time issues, as I say, I do get them to count six or nine or 12 because, I think they can't get straight to counting a dotted beat and fitting a rhythm to it. So if you're in 6/8, you're starting on the premise of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But then why not use the ands twice? So that when you want to get to two beats in a bar in 6/8, 6/16, whatever you're working in, that you then go one and two and. So I don't see any harm in using the and twice when you're dealing with a compound time. And also, just I think it's helpful with something else actually, because the danger, of course, of having done your kind of counting in six is the way people play in 6/8 is often this kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 thing, which is kind of like, ugh, heavy duty, isn't it? And we want them to be able to feel in two. So if you get the idea of using one and two and, but the idea is that when they say a number, they're feeling the pulse, so they're just making a slight emphasis of it. Actually, you start to do some quite useful musical work in compound time as well. So personally, that's the way I do it, but other people would have other approaches to that. Again, it's one of these funny things, isn't it? Because you're starting from a kind of theoretical base point, but you're trying to get to a musical outcome. So it's always about asking yourself, what's the best way to get to a musical outcome? So we don't start with maths and end with maths. um, those would be my thoughts on that. Mm.
In ballet, they count 6/8 as one and two and when they're
Yeah,
dancing.
yes, that's interesting, isn't it?
Hmm.
Yeah, it's a perfectly reasonable way of doing it. Um, it just, for me, I suppose it just adds another element. You've got to remember that, oh, there's two things I've got to do between numbers. Um, but if they can do that, if it works, absolutely. Yeah, no, I've seen that. Having had a daughter who did her rounds of ballet, I saw that they did that. It's quite interesting. Yeah,
And
but
just
yeah,
that
yeah,
wasn't me.
yeah. Well, I have to say I've never been a ballet dancer myself, as you probably guessed, but I have sat through a lot of ballet shows over the years, though. That's quite a task, yeah. When
Well,
your daughter's in item numbers 3, 7, and 56. Oh, good fun. Yeah,
yeah.
great. Well, I don't know. I hope that's useful anyway.
Well, I just thought
But
there's a couple more minutes. If there is anyone who has a question, there's
yeah,
no actual questions in either place.
no, I think
Facebook there.
no,
This is
I
your
think
last moment.
everybody's just thinking, "Oh my goodness, what was all that about?" No, oh, all right. Well, I'm glad it's useful. It's always good to know that people find these things useful, and with all these things anyway, you've got to go away and process it for yourself, haven't you? And think, okay, well, this is my situation. These are the students I'm working with. What of this is going to work here? How do I need to modify it? And that, I think, is the mark of good teaching. And as we said before, what works for one student won't work for another.
And even if
So individualize it.
even if
Sorry.
we if I hear something and I think I don't agree with that when I'm at a pedagogic webinar, I don't
Yeah.
agree with it. I still write it down because never ever ever do you never know which student in the future all your ideas aren't working for and you go for this one that I didn't actually agree with this idea, but let me try it on this student. So it's always worth it. I'm not saying I disagree with anything you said because I didn't, but just
Yeah.
as a
No, no, feel
principle.
free. Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. And you end up sometimes doing something really quite unconventional, don't you? And it works. That's great. What's Julie asking here? Advice on remembering the rhythms, grade five oral, for example, where they're longer. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a funny thing, this, isn't it? When you have to remember things in oral tests. I must admit, I've always been a little bit wary of that kind of oral test myself. You know, what are we actually trying to test? Are we testing oral ability or are we testing memory ability? Well, the argument is that memory is an important ingredient for any musician. But actually, always strikes me that memory in oral tests is about short-term memory. If we're memorizing a piece, that's a very different process because it's a much longer term memory thing, isn't it? And we have to go about it in a very different way. But what I will say in response to that question, though, is I think if you do this rhythm work in the sorts of ways that we've talked about, particularly if you take the oral dimension to it, some people who have trouble remembering a rhythm will be able to manage it if they can visualize it. So if you've done this kind of like, okay, I'm going to play a rhythm, you try and clap it back, then tell me what the note lengths were. You get to the point, if you do enough of that, where they have to do these slightly longer things by the time you get to grade five, yeah, that actually they can begin to picture the rhythm. So therefore, they've got the rhythm visualized, not just oralized. That may seem like a big ask, actually, but if you've done it from early stages, by the time they get to grade five, they will be able to do that. Um, so that's one way of dealing with it. I think the other thing, to be honest, in the heat of the moment, you know, when a candidate is in the exam room, they've already gone through all the pre-exam stress and they've had to play all these scales and they've gone right, wrong, or indifferently. And they've got through pieces, they've been tortured with the sight reading, and they are absolutely wrung out by the time it comes to the oral test. So now it's kind of, oh, just memorize this thing and sing it back, clap it back, whatever. That's quite an ask, actually. And you see that sort of fatigue coming about. I sometimes have wondered, you know, when it's gone wrong in the hands, particularly in the hands of someone who's a strong candidate. Actually, I wonder if they would have done that in a less stressful situation. But but you know, that's how it is, isn't it? Thankfully, these days there's a lot of other balance in oral tests anyway. You know, so oral perception work and all that kind of stuff. It's not all about memory. There used to be back in the you know pre-Flintstone days when I was doing these things, a lot more emphasis on memory. Thankfully, that's reduced a bit, but yeah. But I think certainly that idea of working at it orally and getting them to think whether they can identify the rhythms is another way of being able to do
Can
it.
can I add to your
I've got
answer?
lots of very, go on,
Oh,
yeah.
sorry. So, Julie, just to add to that, if you, it was something that Gareth said earlier about the person who comes to him for one lesson on oral just before the exam,
Yeah.
the way the memory works, that gradually the brain will start chunking patterns. So the short-term memory, which is sometimes called the working memory, is it's like a notepad and it can handle 7 ± 2 things. So between 5 and 9 things. So when we're starting at grade one, they can only handle 5 notes in their rhythm when we first start practicing oral. But if we keep practicing oral regularly, what happens to the brain is it starts chunking things. So it'll hear a pattern like the pattern that was in 6/8, which is da da da, and it hears, and for me that's Amsterdam, and so it hears that as a chunk of its own. So now
Yes.
that 7 things that can be held in the short-term memory are 7 chunks of rhythm they're familiar with. So I think the key is,
Absolutely.
as Gareth said earlier, it's not just one practice because the brain needs time to start chunking information so that it can handle in the exam. But of course, in the exam, everything goes balmy. I did grade 5 just for fun only 2 weeks ago, and in saxophone because I needed another instrument, and I completely mucked up the oral because I couldn't remember, and I was standing there going, I should be able to remember this. This is grade 5. It's easy. But you know, under stress, all sorts of things happen as well. So there's that aspect, but there is the chunking aspect to consider. Sorry, Gareth, I took your.
No, I think that's a very, very good point to make, and it's this thing about the reptilian brain in the exam room, where you just kind of it becomes a complete fog, doesn't it? And even people who've played pieces perfectly nicely in the waiting room suddenly can't play a note. That does happen, and that makes it very difficult to deal with this oral stuff. But yeah, the chunking idea is absolutely right. And you see, if you've done enough work on hearing a dotted rhythm, because you've done this ongoing kind of training with it, then as soon as you hear it in the test, you think, yeah, that's how this starts. You know the first three notes are dotted crotchet, quaver, crotchet, because you are used to that rhythm. Um, and so it's not a particular problem to isolate that part of it and then begin to put it together, as you say, in chunks. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Yeah, that's all good. Good. Yes. Anybody else has?
There's just a
Yeah, that's a good
comment
point.
just
Great to stop and think about what I'm actually doing when teaching rhythm, how it might be improved or expanded upon. Yeah, it's a very important thing to think about. I think we often, it's something I've seen observing teachers at work, that rhythm is often relatively low on the agenda. We make a big deal of learning notes, by which we mean pitch. Um, but actually, well, how important is rhythm in the whole thing? And it actually underpins the confidence of a performance, even advanced level stuff, even at diploma level. I've heard lots of people who deliver notes pretty accurately, but the whole thing is sitting on a banana skin. The pulse is moving around all over the place, not for musical reasons, but just because there isn't a pulse that's underpinning a performance, where we've got rhythms that are not really very accurate. It's all a bit approximate. So it's a terribly important thing for the long term journey. And on the oral thing as well, one idea, of course, which I'm sure lots of people are onto, is a great thing to start a lesson with. Particularly with kids, they come through the door, they've got their coat on, they've got to get an instrument out of the box, and all takes forever. They can't find the music. While they're doing all that faffing about, do some oral work. So keep them going with taking the coat off and finding the instrument, but do some oral work while that's happening. Then you don't lose the first few minutes of the lesson just dealing with all those practicalities. Anyway, makes it more efficient start and starts a lesson with the ears. Not a bad place to start with music, really.
Well, Gareth, we've come to the end of our time, and I thank you so much for generously sharing your wealth of wisdom with us all today, tonight, whatever time of the day it is for us. And I will point out
Yeah.
it's 4 degrees hotter here than it is where you are, but I'm the one rugged up with the heater on. Um,
I'm going to say it's not exactly warm here.
but yeah,
Good.
thank you from all of us for those in the live stream and those in the room. Thank you so much for giving us your morning,
Great.
and we look
Lovely.
forward
Well,
to
lovely to be with you.
seeing
And
you
good
on
luck with all
Facebook.
you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant.
To everyone else, we'll see you next time. Have a great day. Bye
Bye.
for now.